You don't get to dock that boat and pretend none of this belongs to me, Malcolm.
Standing at the foot of the gangway, in a pastel pink wrap coat.
Half your life took off after our divorce. And that yacht? Don't insult me by acting like I had nothing to do with what came before it.
I want my share. That's what Sabrina said. I didn't answer right away. My hand had gone still around the old brass key sitting on the cockpit table. The one with the faded pink float stamped Locker 22, Tide House. Nell Harper, who'd been carrying a stack of harbor event programs toward the clubhouse, stopped cold when she saw it. "Malcolm," she said quietly, "where did you get that key?" Sabrina's eyes flicked to Nell, then back to me. "See," she said, "even now you still do that quiet act, like people won't eventually figure out what you owe." I picked up the key. Then I said, "I think it's time we find out exactly what I owe." To understand why that key mattered, you'd have to go back to the year Sabrina decided waiting on me felt smaller than leaving me. I met Sabrina when I was 28 and working the electrical systems on the container cranes down at the Norfolk terminal. Back then I was good at exactly one thing, and it wasn't talking myself up. I could walk into a control room full of dead breakers and burned wiring and tell you, within an hour, exactly what had failed and why. Port authorities paid well for that kind of quiet, and Sabrina liked the paycheck long before she started resenting the pace it came at. We got married in a small ceremony at her cousin's backyard in Virginia Beach, and for the first few years, it worked the way most marriages work, when nobody's really testing the seams yet. I fixed things. I planned things. I put money away instead of spending it, because I'd grown up watching my father lose a house to bad timing, and I promised myself I'd never let timing catch me off guard again. The trouble started with a piece of waterfront nobody else wanted. There was an old dry dock and service yard off the Elizabeth River, half sunk into disrepair, smelling like diesel and low tide, with a for sale sign that had been leaning sideways for over a year. Everyone who looked at it saw rust and liability. I saw slips that could hold small commercial boats, a shed that could become cold storage for marina vendors, and land that nobody else wanted to touch because it required patience nobody else had. I used almost everything we had saved to hold an option on it. Not buy it outright, I didn't have that kind of money then. Just hold the right to buy it before anyone else could. Sabrina walked the property with me exactly once. She stood on a cracked concrete apron in heels she probably regretted wearing, looked at the water stains on the corrugated siding, and said the words I never really stopped hearing underneath everything else she said to me for years afterward. "This is what you want us to bet on?" she asked. "Malcolm, this is a headache with a dock attached to it." I told her it would take time. I told her the location mattered more than the condition. She told me she didn't want a future that required this much waiting. We divorced 18 months later, quietly, without much drama, the way two people split when one of them has already checked out emotionally, long before the paperwork catches up. In the settlement, Sabrina didn't want anything to do with the yard option. Her attorney at the time called it an underperforming, high-risk asset with unclear upside, and she signed off on leaving it entirely to me, along with the modest guarantee I'd personally attached to the loan that funded the option. I kept the option. I kept my job at the port for 2 more years while I found a partner, a sharp, restless guy named Devin Hart, who'd spent a decade in commercial real estate and saw exactly what I saw in that yard, just from a different angle. Together we built Reed and Hart Waterfront Services out of that cracked concrete apron. One slip and one client, and one small miracle at a time. 18 months later, what she called a headache became the foundation of everything. By the time I bought the Blue Mercy, a modest 52-foot cruiser, nothing extravagant, just something that told the water I finally belonged on it, Reed and Hart had grown into 6 waterfront properties along the Chesapeake, servicing everything from small commercial fishing operations to private marina clients who wanted their boats stored, repaired, and launched without headaches. We weren't a headline. We were something steadier and, in this business, rarer. Reliable. Sabrina found out about the yacht the way most people in Norfolk's waterfront community find out about anything, through someone who'd seen it at a marina mixer and mentioned it to someone else. She didn't call me, she showed up. That's a confrontation you already heard. What you didn't hear yet is what happened in the weeks after it, because Sabrina didn't stop at the pier that night. 3 weeks later, a formal letter arrived at my office, sent by an attorney named Priya Okafor, informing me that my former spouse intended to pursue a claim against, quote, marital property whose value substantially appreciated due to efforts and decisions occurring during the marriage, unquote. I sat with that letter for a long time before I called Celeste Vaughn. Celeste had handled 2 commercial disputes for Reed and Hart over the years, and she had a way of speaking that made you feel like the ground under your feet was more solid than it actually was, right up until she told you exactly where the cracks were. She's arguing the appreciation happened because of decisions you made while you were still married to her, Celeste said, flipping through the letter at her desk. That the yard option was already something of value when you signed the divorce settlement, and that she's owed a share of what it grew into. Is that true? I asked. Legally? Maybe partially arguable, if she can prove the appreciation traces back to marital decisions. Practically? She signed off on that asset. Her attorney at the time called it high risk with unclear upside. That language works against her, not for her. Then why does this feel like it's already costing me something? Because claims like this don't need to be true to be expensive, Celeste said. They need to be filed. I told her about the key. I hadn't thought about it in years, honestly, not since the divorce, when I'd found it tucked in an old filing box I never fully unpacked. It was engraved, Locker 22, Tide House, and I had no memory of where it came from or why I still had it. Only a strange, low-grade discomfort every time I saw it. The kind of feeling you get walking past a door you know you're supposed to open eventually. Find out what it opens, Celeste said. If there's a locker with your name attached to it at Tide House, and it's still active, you have every right to request access to it. Do it properly. Do it through the marina's records office, not by breaking anything open. That's how I ended up back at Tide House Marina on a gray Tuesday morning, standing across the counter from Nell Harper, the same woman who'd frozen the night Sabrina confronted me on the pier. Nell managed the marina's archive room part-time now, mostly digitizing decades of slip agreements and storage records that predated the current ownership group. She had a careful, watchful way about her, like someone who'd spent so many years being the person nobody asked questions of that she'd learned to hold information the way other people hold breath. "You recognized that key the other night," I said, before I even said anything. Nell was quiet for a moment. I remember the day it was issued, she said finally. It's not common for us to still have records that old, but Tide House never digitized the earliest storage lockers properly, so the paper trail's still sitting in boxes nobody's touched in years. Can you tell me whose name is on it? I can tell you what the record request process is, she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, like she wanted to help, but didn't want to be the one who opened the door herself. You submit a written request. I pull what's there. That's how this works, and that's how it should work. It took 9 days for the request to clear the marina's office. 9 days during which Sabrina's attorney sent a second letter, this one sharper, stating that absent a reasonable settlement offer, they intended to seek formal discovery and, if necessary, additional legal remedies to protect her interest in the disputed appreciation. Celeste didn't like the tone of it. Neither did I. But what unsettled me more than the letter was a phone call I got 2 days before the locker finally opened, from a man named Warren Pike. Warren introduced himself as someone who'd handled some of the financial paperwork during my divorce years back, working under the accountant Sabrina's family had used. I barely remembered him, a soft-spoken presence at the edges of a process I'd mostly just endured rather than paid close attention to. Malcolm, he said, I'll be honest with you, because I think honesty saves everybody time. I've seen situations like this drag on for a year, cost both sides more in legal fees than the actual claim is worth, and end exactly where a fair number would have ended it in the first place. I'm not on anybody's side here. I just don't like watching good people bleed money over principle. What number are you talking about? I asked. Something reasonable, he said. Something that acknowledges her position without dragging either of you through a hearing. I could help broker that, quietly, before this gets messier than it needs to be. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't tell him about the locker. Celeste, when I relayed the call to her, went very still in a way I was starting to recognize as her thinking hardest. Courts hate messy paper trails, she said slowly, echoing a phrase Warren had apparently used with 2 other clients of hers in unrelated matters over the years. That's an odd thing for a neutral bystander to say. It's the kind of thing someone says when they don't want anybody looking too closely at a paper trail they had a hand in. What would he have had a hand in? I asked. I don't know yet, she said. But I want to know why a man who worked accounting on your divorce 8 years ago is suddenly so eager to keep this quiet. 2 days later, Nell called to say the locker record had cleared and the physical box had been located in a marina storage annex that hadn't been opened in years. I went alone. I told Celeste I'd photograph everything before touching it, and I did, standing in a narrow records room that smelled like salt and old paper and rusted metal, my hands not quite steady as I turned the brass key in a lock that hadn't been used in what felt like a decade. Inside was a slim accordion folder, water-stained at the corners, and inside that, 3 things that changed the entire shape of what I thought I already understood. The first was a copy of a closing instruction letter, dated during the final stretch of our divorce proceedings, addressed to the accounting office Sabrina's family used. The second was a signed side letter, Sabrina's signature clear and deliberate at the bottom, stating that she voluntarily relinquished any future claim to appreciation in the waterfront yard option in exchange for being formally released from a personal guarantee tied to a separate, riskier venture her family had backed around the same time. The third was a handwritten note, clipped to an envelope, in a hand I didn't recognize, that read simply, Hold until refi clears. I stood there for a long time, reading the side letter twice, then a third time, because I needed to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding something my own hope was bending in my favor. She hadn't been cut out of that asset. She'd traded it away. Nell, when I brought her the folder to ask about the handwritten note, went quiet again. But this time the quiet had a different weight to it. "I remember that envelope," she said. "Sabrina asked me to hold it in the archive, separate from the general Marina files, because she said it dealt with something private, about a refinancing, and she didn't want her name attached to the risk side of it publicly. I didn't know what was inside. I just did what she asked, because that's the kind of thing people ask you to do quietly, and you don't think much of it at the time." "Did she say why?" I asked. "She said it was easier to be free of one thing so she could move forward on another," Nell said. I didn't ask more than that. It wasn't my business. Celeste, when I brought her copies of everything, read the side letter twice with the same careful attention I had, then looked up at me with something between relief and warning in her expression. "This is strong," she said. "If this is authentic and it holds up, it directly contradicts the claim she's making. She didn't lose access to this asset in the divorce. She released her claim to it voluntarily, in writing, in exchange for a separate benefit." "Then this ends now," I said. "It should," Celeste said. But being right on paper didn't stop the next blow. 3 days after I filed a formal response through Celeste, referencing the side letter and requesting the claim be withdrawn, Sabrina's attorney filed something I hadn't expected. Along with an amended claim, they filed a notice, a lis pendens, against a new acquisition Reed and Hart had been quietly finalizing for months. A larger dry dock facility 2 properties down the river, one that would have doubled our servicing capacity for mid-size commercial vessels. The notice didn't have to prove anything to work. It only had to exist, sitting in the public record, attached to a property in the middle of a financing process for our lender to get nervous. Devin called me before Celeste did, his voice tight in a way I rarely heard from him. "Malcolm, the underwriting team just put a pause on the loan," he said. "They're citing active litigation touching the borrower's other assets. This isn't a formality. If this drags out, we lose the window on this deal completely." "How much is on the table?" I asked, even though I already knew the number well enough to feel it in my chest. "A $4 million acquisition, with financing already lined up before this notice hit," Devin said. "If we lose the window, we don't just lose this property. We lose the position we've spent 2 years building toward it." I called Celeste that night. She listened, quiet, then said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this entire process. "You have the truth," she said. "You don't yet have speed. And in a financing deadline, speed sometimes matters more than truth, at least in the short term." "What are you telling me to do?" "I'm telling you what's coming," she said. "Warren Pike is going to call you again, and this time he's going to sound a lot more urgent." She was right. Warren called 2 days later, and this time there wasn't much softness in his voice at all, just a kind of practiced concern that had hardened into something closer to pressure. "Malcolm, I heard about the notice on your new acquisition," he said. "That's a real cost now, not a hypothetical one. I still think there's a number that makes this go away quietly, before the lender gets spooked into walking entirely. I'm trying to help you protect what you've actually built here." "Why do you care so much about this settling quietly, Warren?" I asked. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before he answered. "Because messy disputes hurt everybody attached to them," he said, "including people who had nothing to do with the original dispute in the first place." That answer bothered me more than any of the pressure had. I mentioned it to Celeste, who'd already started quietly pulling the original financial worksheet used during my divorce settlement, the one that was supposed to list all marital assets and their disposition. "The side letter isn't referenced anywhere in this worksheet," she told me 2 days later, spreading the old document across her desk. Which means either it was overlooked by accident or someone made a decision to leave it out. "Who prepared the worksheet?" I asked, though I think some part of me already suspected the answer. "Warren Pike," Celeste said, "or at least his firm at the time. His name is on the summary page." I sat with that for longer than I probably needed to. Warren wasn't just a nervous bystander trying to save everyone legal fees. He was the man who had built the very document that made Sabrina's claim look plausible on paper in the first place, by leaving out the one piece of evidence that would have made it collapse. Around that same time, a different piece of information reached me, almost by accident, through a mutual acquaintance at a waterfront hospitality event I attended for Reed and Hart. Sabrina, now working in luxury brand partnerships and events, had been quietly involved for the past 2 years in a boutique waterfront hospitality venture with a partner named Trent Calloway, an ambitious project meant to compete with some of the higher-end marina lounges further up the coast. The acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that the venture had been struggling with cash flow for months, that a planned expansion had stalled, and that there'd been talk among vendors of unpaid invoices piling up quietly behind a very polished public front. I didn't confirm it right away, but it reframed everything. Sabrina wasn't pressing this claim from a position of strength. She was pressing it from a position of quiet desperation, dressed up in the language of fairness because desperation doesn't sound as respectable as fairness does. I told Celeste. She nodded slowly, unsurprised. "That explains the urgency," she said. "Claims like this move slowly when someone's arguing principle. They move fast when someone needs the money now." Devin, when I told him the same thing, wasn't nearly as measured. "So we're supposed to lose a $4 million deal because her new business can't make payroll?" he said. "Malcolm, I get wanting to do this the right way, but the lender isn't going to wait for our sense of moral clarity. If this notice isn't gone in 3 weeks, they're pulling out completely, and that opportunity goes to someone else." "I know," I said. "Then what are you going to do?" he asked. "Because right now, being right isn't paying for the steel we need on that new dock." That night I stood on the deck of the Blue Mercy long after the marina had gone quiet, the acquisition paperwork spread across the cockpit table beside the same brass key that had started all of this. For the first time since the divorce, the cost of holding my ground wasn't abstract. It wasn't a matter of pride or patience. It was a real number attached to a real deadline, threatening something I had built with my own hands over years of exactly the kind of quiet persistence Sabrina once told me was beneath the life she wanted. I thought about calling Warren back and giving him a number, something reasonable, something that would lift the notice, satisfy the lender, and let the acquisition close on schedule. Nobody outside this small circle would ever know the difference between a man who settled to protect his business and a man who folded because the truth got expensive. I actually picked up the phone. Celeste called me before I dialed, as if she'd sensed exactly where my head had gone. "If you settle now," she said, without preamble, "this becomes her version of events forever. Not because it's true, but because it's the version that got paid. And paid versions have a way of becoming the official story, whether they deserve to or not." "I don't want to lose this acquisition, Celeste," I said. "I've spent 2 years on it." "I know," she said, "but I've watched people fold at exactly this point before. Not because they were wrong, but because being right suddenly became inconvenient. You don't have to fold. You have real documentation. You have a witness. What you don't have yet is a room where you get to say it out loud, on the record, where it actually counts." "Then get me that room," I said. She did. Within a week, what had started as informal settlement discussions escalated, at Celeste's request, into a formal evidentiary conference, a short hearing before a retired judge acting as mediator, with both parties' attorneys required to present documentation and, if necessary, witness testimony regarding the disputed asset and the notice filed against my pending acquisition. The morning of the hearing, I stood outside the small conference room in a navy suit that Sabrina, years ago, would have said looked like something a man wears when he wants to seem more important than he actually is. I didn't wear it for her. I wore it because I finally understood something I hadn't fully understood the night she stood on that pier and called the yacht insulting. Some rooms require you to show up like you already know exactly who you are. Sabrina was already seated when I walked in, pale pink blouse beneath a tailored blazer, her expression composed in the careful, practiced way I remembered from years of watching her prepare for events where image mattered more than comfort. Her attorney, Priya Okafor, sat beside her with a folder thick enough to suggest confidence. Warren Pike sat 2 seats down the table, positioned, I noticed, close enough to Sabrina's side to suggest he wasn't quite as neutral as he'd claimed to be on every phone call leading up to this moment. Celeste sat beside me, calm, prepared, but she leaned toward me just before the mediator called things to order and said quietly, "When it's time, you say the core of this yourself. I'll walk them through the documents. But the reason this matters has to come from you." Priya opened for Sabrina's side, framing the claim in careful, reasonable language. That the waterfront property had been conceived of during the marriage, that Sabrina's early support and household contributions had allowed me the flexibility to pursue that vision, and that fairness required recognizing her role in a foundation she helped make possible, even if her name wasn't on later paperwork. It was a good argument. It might have even worked if it weren't for what was sitting in the folder in front of Celeste. Celeste walked the room through the timeline first, the original option, the divorce settlement language explicitly characterizing the yard as high risk with unclear upside, and Sabrina's own attorney's characterization of it at the time. Then she introduced the side letter, the closing instruction, and Nell Harper's sworn statement confirming she had held the sealed envelope at Sabrina's specific request. Priya pushed back immediately, calling the documents incomplete, questioning the chain of custody, suggesting the side letter could have been signed under different circumstances than it appeared. That's when Celeste turned to me. "This is the part where you say what needs to be said," she said quietly. I stood because it felt like a thing that needed to be said standing, And I looked at Sabrina for a long moment before I spoke. "I'm not here to humiliate you," I said. "I'm not going to bring up anything about your life now that has nothing to do with this. I only want the truth in the room, because I spent a long time in our marriage staying quiet when I should have spoken up, and I'm done doing that." Sabrina's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "You didn't lose access to that yard option in our divorce," I continued. "You gave it up voluntarily, in writing, because you wanted out from under a personal guarantee tied to something riskier you and your family were pursuing at the time. That's not me taking something from you. That's a decision you made on paper with your own signature. Because in that moment, waiting on a slow, uncertain waterfront property felt like a worse bet than the one you chose instead." I turned to Warren. "And I think you know that too," I said, "because your firm prepared the worksheet that somehow left this side letter out entirely. I don't know if that was convenience or something worse, but I know it wasn't an accident, because you've spent the last month calling me, pushing me to settle quietly before anyone looked too closely at exactly that omission." Warren's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known him. He started to say something about summary simplification, about not wanting to complicate an already difficult worksheet, but the mediator asked him directly whether he had been aware of the side letter's existence at the time the worksheet was prepared, and his hesitation answered the question more clearly than his words did. "I'm not asking for punishment," I said, turning back to the room. "I'm asking for the record to reflect what actually happened. I'm asking for this claim to be withdrawn, for the notice on my new acquisition to be lifted, and for this to be over, honestly, for both of us." The room was quiet for a long moment after that, the kind of quiet that doesn't need anyone to fill it. Priya requested a brief recess to confer with her client. When they returned 40 minutes later, the claim was formally withdrawn with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled, and Sabrina's attorney submitted the paperwork necessary to release the Liz Pindens on my acquisition that same afternoon. Warren Pike didn't stay long after that. I heard, through channels I didn't chase down myself, that his firm opened an internal review into how the earlier worksheet had been prepared. I didn't ask for more than that, because that part of the story wasn't mine to finish. The lender, despite the notice being lifted, informed Devon 2 days later that the delay had already pushed us past a financing window they weren't willing to reopen on the same terms. And the $4 million dry dock acquisition, the one we'd spent 2 years quietly positioning ourselves for, slipped away to another buyer before we could restructure the deal. Devon took it hard for about a week. I did too, honestly, more than I let on. There's a particular kind of grief in losing something you built toward for years, even when you know you did the right thing to lose it. But 3 weeks later, a different opportunity came, one I hadn't been chasing at all. A regional investment group that had heard about the dispute and about how it ended reached out to Devon directly, saying they respected that we hadn't settled quietly just to make a problem disappear, and that they were interested in backing an expansion of Reed and Hart service yards further up the Chesapeake on terms considerably better than the deal we'd lost. I didn't get to keep the acquisition I'd fought so hard to protect, but I kept something else, something I hadn't fully understood the value of until I almost gave it away in Warren Pike's version of a quiet, practical settlement. That night, Sabrina asked to speak to me alone, away from attorneys, away from marina crowds, Just the two of us standing near the empty end of the pier where the Blue Mercy was docked. "I didn't do this because I hated you," she said, arms crossed against the evening chill. "I want you to know that. Watching you build all of this after I walked away from it because I thought it was beneath the life I wanted, that's a hard thing to sit with quietly." "I know," I said. "I told myself I was owed something fair," she said. "Maybe I just didn't want to admit I'd been the one who gave it away." I stood there for a moment, looking at her, thinking about every version of this conversation I might have imagined having over the years. Every angry, satisfied version where I got to watch her understand exactly what she'd lost. None of those versions felt like what I actually wanted to say. "You didn't lose your share of my life today," I said. "You gave it away years ago when you decided waiting on me felt beneath you. I'm not angry about that anymore. I just don't need you to see it the way I do. I stopped needing that a while back. I just didn't realize it until this week." She didn't say anything to that, not right away. She just nodded once, like something in her had finally stopped arguing with the truth. And then she turned and walked back up the pier toward the parking lot, and I let her go without following, without adding anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The next morning, I stood on the deck of the Blue Mercy as the sun came up over the marina. The water calm, the air still carrying that early, salt-heavy quiet that Norfolk mornings have before the day gets loud. I took the brass key, the one engraved Locker 22, Tide House, and set it inside a small wooden box I kept in the cabin, not as a trophy, not as proof of anything I needed to keep proving, just as a closed chapter that didn't need to stay in my pocket anymore. Devin called about an hour later, already talking about site plans for the new expansion, already moving forward the way he always did, and I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not because I'd won some grand, symbolic victory over Sabrina, but because I finally understood something that took me over 40 years and one very long claim to learn. For most of my life, I thought success was something you built until someone else finally recognized it. Until the person who once called your patience a headache eventually admitted she'd been wrong. I don't think that anymore. I built Reed and Hart out of a cracked concrete yard nobody wanted, one slow, unglamorous decision at a time. And somewhere along the way, without noticing exactly when it happened, I stopped needing Sabrina or anyone else to tell me it had been worth it. People will call you slow sometimes, simply because they've run out of patience for the version of you that hasn't finished growing yet. That's not a verdict on your worth. It's just a measure of how long someone else was willing to wait. I started the Blue Mercy's engine that morning, guided her slowly out past the breakwater, and watched Norfolk's waterfront shrink behind me, not as evidence of anything, not as a monument to anyone who once doubted it, just as the place I happen to live now, quiet, steady, and finally, fully mine. 3 months passed before I thought about Locker 22 again, and when I did, it wasn't because of Sabrina. Devin had scheduled a small groundbreaking ceremony for the new expansion the investment group backed, out on a stretch of shoreline just north of our original yard, close enough that you could still see the old rusted crane arm from the property where everything started. He wanted press there, a local reporter or two, maybe a short piece in the regional business journal. I told him I'd come, but I wasn't interested in giving a speech about resilience or vindication. I just wanted to watch the first pilings go into ground we actually owned outright. Nell came to the ceremony too, though nobody had really invited her in any official capacity. She showed up in a windbreaker, hands in her pockets, standing a little apart from the small crowd, the way she always did. Like someone who'd spent a career believing her job was to keep things running, not to be seen doing it. I found her near the edge of the gathering and thanked her again, properly this time, not just for testifying, but for keeping that envelope safe for years, without ever knowing what was riding on it. You didn't have to do that, I told her. Nobody would have blamed you for saying you didn't remember, or that the paperwork got lost somewhere along the way. That would have been easier for you. Nell shrugged, though I could tell the words meant something to her. I spent 30 years being the person people handed things to because they trusted I wouldn't lose them, she said. If I'd lied about that the one time it actually mattered, I don't think I could have called myself that person anymore. The marina's ownership group ended up creating a small paid archivist position for her not long after the hearing, formal this time, with a modest salary and her name on the door of the records room instead of just a set of keys. I didn't ask for that on her behalf. Celeste mentioned once that a retired judge who'd sat in on our conference had made a quiet call to the marina's board, saying something about the value of people who protect the truth even when nobody's watching. I never confirmed it. I didn't need to. Warren Pike's story ended less gently, though not in the way I expected. His firm's internal review turned into something larger once 2 other former clients came forward with concerns about worksheets he'd prepared around the same period, and by early the following year, he'd quietly stepped back from client-facing work altogether. I heard he'd taken a position doing internal audit support somewhere outside the region, a smaller job, further from anyone who might recognize his name. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get watching a support beam finally give way after you'd already reinforced everything around it. The failure wasn't dramatic. It was just overdue. Sabrina's waterfront hospitality venture with Trent Calloway didn't survive the year. I learned that from Devon, who heard it from someone at a supplier meeting, mentioned almost in passing the way business failures in a small industry tend to travel. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. If anything, I understood something about her a little more clearly. The way people sometimes chase one bright, visible thing after walking away from something slower and steadier, only to find the bright thing was never built to last the way the slow thing was. I ran into her once more, almost by accident, at a community fundraiser event downtown that Reed and Hart had quietly sponsored a table for. She was there representing a smaller boutique agency now, still polished, still composed, though something in her posture had softened since the pier and since the hearing room. We didn't talk long. She asked how the expansion was going. I told her, briefly, honestly. She asked if Devon was still around. I told her he was, and that he'd started teaching a night class on small business development at the community college, something he'd wanted to do for years, but never had the bandwidth for until the acquisition freed up. "That's good," she said. "He always had more patience than people gave him credit for." "So did I said. Eventually. She almost laughed at that. A small, tired sound, not bitter, just tired in the way people get when they've finally stopped carrying something they used to think was necessary weight. "I hope it works out, all of it," she said. And I believed she meant it, even if I understood we'd probably never be more than two people who occasionally crossed paths at events neither of us needed to attend. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than the parts of this story that make for a satisfying ending. I didn't walk away from that hearing feeling like I'd won something enormous. I walked away having lost a $4 million acquisition I'd spent 2 years building toward. And for a while, that loss sat heavier on me than the vindication did. There were nights that spring where I sat on the deck of the Blue Mercy doing the math over and over, wondering if a faster, quieter settlement might have let me keep both the truth and the deal, if I just found the right number sooner. Celeste told me once, months later, over coffee near her office, that she didn't think that math ever really worked out the way people hoped it would. You can buy quiet, she said, but you can't buy the version of yourself who didn't have to. Most people don't realize that's the actual price of a quick settlement, until they're the ones living inside the version of themselves who paid it. I think about that more than I think about the hearing itself, honestly. Because the hearing was over in an afternoon. The question of who I wanted to be walking out of it stayed with me a lot longer. The regional investment group that eventually backed our new expansion turned out to be a better partner than the lender we'd lost, in ways that had nothing to do with money. They asked good questions. They didn't flinch at slow timelines. One of their partners, a woman named Adeze Okonkwo, who'd built her own reputation the unglamorous way, told me during our first real planning meeting that she'd specifically wanted to work with us because of how the dispute had ended, not despite it. We don't fund people because they never have problems, she said. We fund people because of how they behave when the problem is expensive to solve honestly instead of quietly. That expansion broke ground on schedule, and by the following summer, Reed and Hart had nearly doubled its original footprint, servicing everything from small fishing charters to larger commercial vessels that used to have to travel 2 hours further up the coast for the same work. Devon hired 6 new full-time technicians that year, 3 of them kids who'd grown up around the original yard back when it was still just rusted equipment and a leaning for sale sign nobody wanted. I kept the Blue Mercy docked at Tide House the whole time, though I noticed something had changed in how I felt walking down that gangway. It wasn't a symbol I needed anyone to notice anymore. Some mornings I didn't take her out at all. I just sat in the cockpit with coffee, watching the harbor wake up, because I'd finally reached the part of my life where the yacht didn't need to prove anything to anybody, including me. The wooden box where I kept the brass key stayed on a shelf in the cabin, and every so often, when I was looking for something else entirely, I'd catch sight of it and think about that first night on the pier. Sabrina's voice sharp in the cold air, Nell frozen mid-step with a stack of programs in her arms, and the strange, low hum of dread I used to feel just looking at that key, without understanding why. I understand it now. It was never really about a locker, or a side letter, or even the $4 million we lost chasing the truth instead of a settlement. It was about a version of me that spent years being useful, being steady, being the person everyone quietly depended on, without ever quite being seen. And one long, expensive season where I finally learned that being seen was never actually the thing I needed. Being solid was enough. It always had been. I'd just spent a long time waiting for someone else to say so before I believed it myself. I don't wait for that anymore. Some mornings, that's the whole difference between the man I used to be and the man who finally sailed the Blue Mercy out past that breakwater, alone, steady, and entirely at peace with a life built one patient decision at a time.